Dr. Augustine joined the National Academy of Public Administration in January of 2019. Sorry, I got the notification that we're recording. I think we're fine. Dr. Augustine has led projects for the legislative branch, Department of Commerce, Office of the Inspector General, and the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. And she specializes in intergovernmental relations, public management, public policy assessment, environmental and cultural resources protection, comprehensive and strategic planning, state and local fiscal issues, and planning for investments in facilities and infrastructure. And she's conducted housing for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Labor, District of Columbia Auditor, and the Pew Charitable Trust on such issues as housing and housing finance policy, housing market trends, and state level support for social support programs. Having also, like me, seen government really at all levels and looking at programs that work and analyzing those that don't work, I think she's, especially with her perspective working at the nexus of government and intergovernmental partnerships, has a wealth of experience and observations to offer us today. So let me turn it over first to Nancy Augustine to tell us about what you've seen working and what we can learn from best practices really around the country in these last few years.
Thank you so much. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here and talk about our work. And I'm looking forward to hearing about the work of our other panelists. The main message that I want to convey today is that intergovernmental collaboration matters. The federal government has long relied on states and localities to implement policies and programs, but they haven't always talked to each other. And I don't know that federal agencies understand or appreciate how state and local governments work. The Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships aims to change that. Just a word about the National Academy. National Academy of Public Administration was established in 1967 to assist government leaders in building more effective, efficient, accountable, and transparent organizations. A unique feature is that we have more than 950 fellows, including former cabinet officers, members of Congress, governors, mayors, and state legislators, as well as prominent scholars, business executives, and public administrators. Most of our activities involve projects that help government leaders deal with their critical management challenges. Our Strategic Initiatives Division, of which I am part, focuses on good government more generally and supports the practice of public administration. So then the Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships was created this past September in the recognition that no significant public initiative fits entirely within one government agency or even one level of government. In fact, the vast majority of domestic policy in the United States is implemented at the state and local level. Our system of government creates a role for all levels of government: federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial. When they don't cooperate, when objectives don't align, when programs overlap or leave gaps, the public's needs can go unmet. The center aims to spur innovation through intergovernmental coordination and collaboration, one initiative at a time. We're working with our partners in the White House, Congress, and several of the Big 7 associations to identify clogs in the intergovernmental system and find ways to clear the pipes. You wouldn't think that different levels of government finding ways to work together effectively would be innovative, but that's where we are. So how are we going to promote innovation? There's been a lot of research on the drivers of innovation in government, and we're taking a very specific angle on it by creating information and building relationships. Working with people on the ground, we want to identify those bottlenecks. Where do we have the discrepancies? Where do we have the systems and programs that don't align? We also want to shed light on how government actually works. When federal agencies design programs, it's clear they don't always understand state and local functioning and decision-making. A little information can go a long way. So I'd like to very quickly describe 3 of our initiatives. One we have support for, and we will take to scale. For the other 2, we have the resources to make a dent, but we're hoping to turn them both into larger projects. First, we expect to start a project next month that will focus on states' processes for business compliance with regulations during the pandemic. This grant-supported research will highlight the regulatory process changes in response to safety concerns, economic and social hardships, and other circumstances created by COVID-19. We will also look for evidence suggesting any long-term changes to state regulatory compliance processes. Our second block of work is going to be the workforce aspects of the Infrastructure Act. Specifically, how do you find enough people to fill the jobs in this full employment economy? And how do you make sure that the people who most need the jobs have a meaningful opportunity to connect to them? We know we have a worker shortage, inadequate childcare, not enough people going into the trades or into STEM fields, and an aging labor force. We plan to feature replicable examples of innovative partnerships among states and their local governments, regional coordination, and the federal government. And finally, we're in the early stages of teeing up some work in social service delivery along the lines of no wrong door. In so many places, social service programs are organized for the convenience of the government, or more likely, the way that the federal government says they have to be organized. People have to go from desk to desk, filling out application after application to get assistance. So we're asking, can't we do better? The idea of a universal gateway, a single point of entry, is not new. We're going to take it a step further to look at why it's so hard to set up and what changes we need at the federal level to make it possible. Instead of making states and local governments file for waivers to be innovative, why not set innovation as the default? Thank you so much. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk this afternoon.
Well, thank you, Dr. Augustine. We'll next hear from Mr. William Glaskill. William Glaskill is a Senior Director of Public Finance at the Volcker Alliance, a New York-based nonprofit, where he has supervised the publication of numerous working papers and studies, including five truth and integrity in state budgeting reports from 2015 to 2021. Previously, he was managing editor for states and municipalities at Bloomberg News, senior editor at Business Week magazine, editorial director of Investment Advisor magazine, and a vice president at Standard & Poor's. Mr. Glaskill. I believe you're muted.
There we go. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ben. We've actually done a bunch of work with the state of Utah and the Utah legislature, and University of Utah is one of our critical research partners. So I appreciate what you're doing, and also thank you, Nancy, for setting up this intergovernmental cooperation committee. It's something that concerns us very much. The federal government in a normal year spends $800 billion or sends $800 billion a year to states and municipalities in a very fragmented fashion, not always with a lot of performance management attached to it. So it's something we're paying close attention to. So in a couple of minutes, I want to go over where we've been, what we've learned so far, and where we're going about state budgets. We do, as Ben mentioned, an annual survey called Truth and Integrity in State Budgeting. What this does is grades the states in 5 building block areas of budgeting, but what it doesn't do is compare numbers against numbers. It's very hard to do that. What we do is look at transparency, sustainability, the things that make budgets work from year to year to year. We've suspended the grades for now because everything is one-time revenue. It's all federal funds or the second order of federal funds. So we'll be back to that shortly. But in the meantime, how are states positioned as we went into COVID? Building block number 1 is budget forecasting. States were okay, not in terms of accuracy, but in terms of process. A lot of improvement needed and a lot of improvement noted, and I'll touch on that in a moment. Budget maneuvers, one-time actions. You can't really build a budget that's based on Scotch tape and good wishes. You really need to match continuing revenue with continuing expenditures. States improved a lot because we had a 10-year recovery. Revenues were strong. States didn't have to do a lot of one-time maneuvers, except for the usual offenders: New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Illinois, and on the red side of the ledger, Kansas and even Kentucky. So it's something to watch when the federal money goes away. We look at legacy costs. Legacy costs is pensions and retiree health care for public employees. That got better during the period because the economy improved. Last year, public pensions, state public pensions recorded 20 to 40% gains. That's not necessarily replicable from year to year. It depends on Wall Street, but we still have a big overhang. So instead of $1 trillion in liabilities, unfunded liabilities for pensions, maybe we have $800 billion. It's an area that needs work, needs innovation, especially in the area of plan design, and needs non-punitive action rather than punitive type of measures. And we look at budget transparency. Most states post their budgets. Transparency is okay, but where they could improve a lot is in deferred infrastructure maintenance disclosure. We've done some work on this area. We estimate there's at least $1 trillion around the states in deferred infrastructure maintenance. That's an unfunded liability like pensions, and it comes into focus because of ARPA and the infrastructure bill and maybe Build Back Better. All of these bills have infrastructure money in them. If states and cities and counties aren't really counting up what they haven't done and what their backlog is, or if they're doing it inconsistently, how do they really know what they're going to put their money into, and how can they best spend their money? I hope the federal government helps with this. Some of the state budget innovations and improvements we noticed going into the COVID years was states were getting very serious about rainy day funds. Rainy day funds finished 2019 at almost 8% of general fund revenue. That's close to a record. S&P just this week estimated that rainy day funds are headed for 10% of general fund revenue. That would be a record, probably an unprecedented number. It's not a benchmark necessarily, but the median was about 8%. Some states like Wyoming, which have very volatile revenues, keep a year's worth of revenues on tap just in case. And what we'd like to see in rainy day fund innovation is more states indexing or linking their reserves to historical revenue volatility. There's 5 states that do this right now. I'm sorry, about 20 states do this right now. About 5 states added it during 2015 to 19, and we hope this will continue. More states are also forecasting for the long term. We have a pretty low bar for long term. It's 3 years past the current fiscal year. 6 states joined others doing that, estimating expenditures. 32 now do the same for longer term revenues, with Illinois, South Dakota, Utah, and Vermont joining the list. Utah is notable for having a 3-year budget process that the legislature passed unanimously. It was called the Beat Idaho bill because Utah scored lower than Idaho on our metrics. Be that as it may, Utah is a tremendous example for other states, and more states. Even though I said nasty things before about infrastructure maintenance gaps, more states are doing this. There's 6 states that have that now report this in budget or related documents. Idaho is the latest to join the list with some help from us as well as some other authorities, and we encourage states and cities like Washington D.C. does this. States and cities really need to look a lot closer at the state of their deferred maintenance. A very quick word, and then I'll finish up on ARPA. One of the greatest worries on ARPA is the fiscal cliff. What happens when the money is all spent by 2024 to 2026? That's the final deadline. At least 18 states are allocating funds to the revenue replacement category. There's also a lot of capital improvement areas. So we have to watch this very closely. If states and cities and counties are expanding their programs with federal funds, that's great for now, but what happens after 2024? Will the tax revenue be there, or then do we see cuts? And God forbid, what happens in a recession? And one last question about innovation. ARPA has within it a great deal of performance management, performance metrics, gold data-driven project design. What I'm hoping is that these principles are used and that they stick after the ARPA era and the infrastructure program era fades. We have especially we have opportunities for some innovation in 3 infrastructure areas that are allowable spending. One is water and sewer infrastructure. The second is broadband, which has been a feature of almost every piece of legislation passed by Congress, and then also affordable housing. So we're looking really for data-driven project design and evaluation as time goes on. We'll be following this closely. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Glasgow, for those comments. Well, I'd love to follow up on some more of those. And always, here in Utah, we like to shoot high. So beating Idaho is a great goal. If only we could have beat Ohio in the Rose Bowl a couple of weeks ago. We'll now love to hear from Mr. Michael Grossman. Michael Grossman is Managing Director at Social Finance, where he leads its impact investing work. Previously, Michael was at New Island Capital, where he established its mission-oriented lending business and made market rate loans to social enterprises to finance intermediaries and nonprofits in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, natural foods, education, and financial inclusion in the US and emerging markets. So with that, I'd love to hear from you, Mr. Grossman.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's great to be here. I really enjoyed listening to Bill and Nancy, and I recently joined Social Finance, which is a 11-year-old national impact finance and advisory nonprofit. We work we have established ourselves really to focus on outcomes-based financing and outcomes-based financing advisory work. And I've been at Social Finance for 4 months. So everything I'm going to say with the fervor of the newly converted. And I'm going to also use the word we a lot and take credit, as all good senior management should do, of the work that was done by the people before me. But Social Finance has spent the last, as I said, so we launched our business around social impact bonds. And as those moved, we arranged, a couple hundred, $225 million social impact in social impact financing over the last 10 years. And over the last couple of years, we've, looked at other ways where we could help arrange outcomes-based financing. And we looked at the challenges facing the United States. I mean, you described yourself as an optimist. As a Utah Democrat, someone who works for a place called Social Finance. You talk about optimism, right? But we really do think about finance as a tool to drive positive social change. And one of the areas where finance can be most useful in driving positive social change is areas around economic mobility. And we've spent the last couple of years looking at ways where we could help contribute to increased economic mobility in the United States. And, a lot of effort has been done by states, by the federal government, by lots of other actors. Most notably, the thing like I'm amazed at is, college is free for so many people now. But it's also fair to say that a lot of probably low-income adults are not really interested in going to college or returning to college, but they would also probably benefit significantly, we realize, from some kind of intensive workforce development training, and training for which generally financing is not largely available like it is for the Title IV institutions and student loans. And so we ended up with a product called the Career Impact Bond. And the Career Impact Bond is a holistic financing mechanism shaped around either an income share agreement or an outcomes-based loan. And what's important, what you call it, if it's an income share agreement or an outcomes-based loan, the important thing is, there's 2 important things to remember. One is that we address these in a very student-friendly manner. In the United States, income share agreements are generally used for people who have limited access to financing. And when people have limited access to financing, the financing partners generally, unfortunately, we can all agree, can take advantage of them. We work really hard we've developed a series of student-centric, student-friendly, ethical income share agreements that start with a student bill of rights, and start with a repayment schedule based only on realized income changes, which include things like payment caps, so that students end up paying rates that are competitive with what they would be able to borrow if they were able to borrow money. And it's really a tool that we have built for impact. We work with students and training providers to also provide a series of wraparound services that we've observed are essential, particularly for low-income students as they progress through career education and workforce development. We've raised $50 million for the UP Fund, a workforce development fund. We raised this $50 million from some of the leading impact investors in the United States. Blue Meridian Partners is a huge partner of ours, Schmidt Futures, MacArthur Foundation, the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, and a large number of high net worth individuals who understand that there is an opportunity to provide financing for workforce development and get their money back. But that as a model, while very successful, well, in its infancy, and we hope very successful, and we've got 4 of these career impact bonds in the market right now, several with IT providers and 1 with a diesel repair organization. The application of the career impact bond through the upfund structure is limited both by the availability of capital of social investors and by the fact that we're seeking to return capital. So we've developed, in partnership with a number of states, a new modality for career impact bonds, which we're calling the Pay It Forward Fund. The Pay It Forward Fund is basically a self-sustaining workforce development financing mechanism that we're implementing with several state partners right now. And the key element in this is that capital is recycled. Generally speaking, if you think about how state workforce funding works, it's really input, and the best way is output based, right? You finance a number of students. You give a training provider some money, and that's either based on the number of students enrolled or perhaps the number of students who graduate in the best case. What we're working on is developing these pay it forward funds where initial grant capital is then recycled by students who pay as a percentage of their incomes, changes in their income. And that money is repaid into the fund, and the fund is paid again and again and again. So even assuming relatively conservative repayment rates of 40%, we would think that this multiplies the funding availability by 2 or 3 times over the life of the facility. We're also really excited about this because it allows our state partners to really focus on their own economic development objectives and priorities. And they can do that in a couple of ways. One, they can work with training providers to provide training dollars for areas that they think are important for their jobs, for their local economies. But also they can use the tools of an income share agreement to focus specific activities, like having the income repayment threshold high enough that training providers only will seek to provide training to higher income jobs. And there's lots of tools that we're working with 6 states right now. New Jersey was the pioneer in the development of the Pay It Forward Fund and launched the very first one. We're working with the state of New Jersey, and we're working with 5 other states to develop workforce training financing facilities that we hope will be both replicable in their own states, but also replicable temporarily as they seek to try new financing mechanisms. Thanks.
Fascinating. Yeah, fascinating, Mr. Grossman. Great to hear this incredible innovations and work that really can expand opportunity for so many people in this time where people are seeking advancement and to retool. Next, we'll hear from Jennifer Park. Jennifer is the Executive Director of the Opportunity Accelerator, a new place-based initiative partnering with the public sector to scale solutions that improve economic and social mobility and advance racial equity in communities. And Jen is also the founding director of certification and community at Bloomberg Philanthropies What Works Cities. And in that role, she launched the data-driven local government that helps cities benchmark their process and develop a roadmap for using data to drive effective change and deliver results for their residents. So Jen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ben. And thank you, Nancy, Bill, and Mike. It's really great to hear and shared innovative examples and approaches at the federal, state, local government, all really centered around economic and social mobility, especially in our municipal governance. And as Ben mentioned, I'm with Results for America, and our mission is really to partner with leaders at every level of government to advance the use of data and evidence to make decisions that ultimately improve the lives of residents. And at the local level, through Bloomberg Philanthropies What Works Cities initiative, we've now partnered and supported hundreds of cities in better building that data infrastructure to more effectively tackle both pressing problems, but also think about how to mitigate future problems as well. And our What Works City certification program provides leading examples and practices on how governments across the country how city governments across the country can build that data infrastructure and then ultimately make the capacity, executive, structural, systemic changes that governments should make to be able to really understand how data can be leveraged for decision making and then ultimately deliver better services for their residents. And a big part of our program is also recognizing excellence. And to date, we have 50 cities that have achieved What Works City certification. And later in this panel, you'll hear from 3 of them. I think through our partnership with local government, we've seen a few trends emerge, especially over the last 5 years. There really is an appetite to invest and further invest in the capacity to leverage data. And what just began as a handful of cities has spread to hundreds, both large and small, in every region. And they're really embracing data and transforming how they operate, how they tackle challenges, make budget decisions, and really engage their residents to deliver services that are more effective and equitable. Last year, the Monitor Institute at Deloitte released a report highlighting this growing movement of cities that have made significant progress in closing the skills gap around key data practices. And just to highlight a few key points from that, of the cities that participated in the research, the percentage of cities actually engaging their residents on a goal or communicating progress has tripled. Cities are using platforms and processes to release data to residents and are actually being more transparent about what data that they have and they're collecting and analyzing. And the percentage of cities modifying existing programs based on data analytics has more than doubled. But most importantly, I think cities are reporting that by actually improving their use of data, they're also improving local services, being more transparent and engaging residents in decision-making and better allocating government dollars. And this is the type of progress and improvements that we need in local governments so that we can continue to build trust and engage residents along the way. Secondly, cities are leveraging data to be more equitable, especially around their budgeting and their financial decisions. We're seeing cities, especially as they think about how to make short-term and long-term decisions around federal and state funding, really apply a more resident-centered, data-driven approach to rethink procurement, deployment of funds, what programs are working, what's not working, how you apply evaluations to actually shift funding and shift dollars to programs that benefit their residents. And so over the last few years, and especially through our city budgeting work, we've seen cities actually take bold steps to rethink how they do their budgeting processes, how they think about their capital investments, and ultimately deploy funding that's more aligned to what resident outcomes they want to see, and of course, driven by data analysis. And later you'll actually hear from my colleague Jen, who will talk a little bit more about how cities are planning and deploying the first round of American Rescue Plan investments. And then finally, I think as we've seen this movement of cities invest in data practices, we're now going to start to see cities actually talk more about how that investment in data practices is actually leading to better, more positive, more equitable outcomes for their residents. And we'll continue to see across the country examples of how investing in that data, collecting it, applying more strategic procurement, doing the evaluations are accelerating these outcomes, especially around social and economic mobility, and really improving the well-being of communities. And as I mentioned later in our panel discussion, we'll actually hear from 3 of our city leaders who are taking the data and innovations and actually applying it to impactful programs that are changing the way not only city government operates, but how they're actually engaging and ensuring that their residents are having the best possible life they can in the cities that they're living in. Thank you, Ben. I'm going to pass it back to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Jen. And I think really interesting stuff here. I think people are going to really look forward to coming back and taking a deeper dive in this as we're going to have a little bit of time right now to go through some of the questions in the chat and summarize some of the things that we've talked about. And then I'm going to turn it back to Jen, who's going to facilitate a deeper dive into some of these very issues right here. But I'm looking through the chat, and I encourage people to put questions in the chat if you have them that you want to spotlight. But I'd like to jump off with a couple. First of all, we are in the midst of ARPA, right? Which is another incredible, we talked about the pandemic and the shocks to the system and the challenges that's placed on government. ARPA, maybe in a different light, has also been a pressure that has caused innovation, maybe in a positive way, that they've got funds to allocate. But I guess my question for the panelists would be, what happens to our state and local budgets once the ARPA money is spent by 2024 to 2026? And just go ahead and jump right in.
Well, so my answer is the easiest, I think. So I'm going to jump in first, which is I think the unique sustaining structure of the Pay It Forward Fund helps alleviate the cliff, right? It doesn't eliminate it, but at least it ideally should extend it over a period of time. And actually what we're seeing our state partners do is use ARPA funds to extend their availability and make it less abrupt, if not eliminated entirely.
I agree with you on that, but if you look at some states are using the vast majority or even all of their funding for revenue replacement. California, New York City. So we don't know where this is going yet. There's a lot of debate and dispute. And we don't know what will happen if the current Federal Reserve cycle puts us into recession, if COVID spreads some more. There's a lot of unknowns. But I agree that in Philadelphia, the budget director is very, very cognizant about this. It is husbanding or spousing, if you will, the money. But there's also other parts of ARPA which allow for rehiring of employees, merit raises, basically combat pay raises, all of which get built into wage structures that are being affected by inflation. So we may have some unpleasant surprises. Not that people don't deserve this. It's just very hard to plan for.
Well, take a minute and let's go a little bit deeper into that. So ARPA has a strong dose of data-driven program design and results evaluation in it for states and for counties and for cities. We've seen, the challenges and the successes. This panel is largely focused on the silver linings, the things that have worked well. But is this going to improve the general state of performance budgeting?
I'll jump in on that. So I would say that it certainly puts it more on the table, but so much around the performance measurement of ARPA has been not the way we might have designed it. There's, and I will say I'm really looking forward to hearing results for America, because they've done just a heroic job of measuring performance, measuring actual performance. But I'm optimistic, but it certainly is setting a good precedent.
Anyone else? Well, let me, I want to follow back up on some of the questions, maybe some more specific. So Michael, you had some, it was interesting to hear you talk about some of your work to help individuals. The pandemic has significantly disrupted the jobs market. It's disrupted everything, right? But we've seen disruptions across our economic sector, but the pandemic has disrupted the job markets. And workers seem to be stepping back and reevaluating their career choices, quitting their jobs in record numbers. What the media has dubbed the Great Resignation. How can these financing vehicles that you talked about, or maybe I'll broaden it to the other panelists as well, what innovations have we seen that can help workers, especially those at the lower end of the income spectrum, transition to new career opportunities?
It's a excellent question. Thanks, Ben. And I'd love to hear Jen, Nancy, and Bill as well. From our perspective, right? This goes back to the, you know, from a state or a public sector viewpoint, right? Everyone's trying to get the good jobs. I want my city to have good jobs, and I want people to come here. But good jobs is really like a difficult thing, and nobody can really define what they mean by good jobs. I mean, we think of good jobs as, you know, a living wage and a self-sustaining wage. And I think a lot of people are taking a step back from their own experiences and saying, wait a second, this isn't necessarily a good job I have. Is there another way forward? And by providing a financing tool where that's, you know, basically a zero upfront cost, and the only repayment comes from actually a realized income gain, I think it really helps people change directions, change positions. I heard someone describe it the other day where, you know, they were describing the challenge people face. It's between their job and their career. And the difference is you can't necessarily leave a job to pursue a career, because frequently a career requires some kind of credentialing or some kind of skills development, but you can't leave your job to go pursue that, either because you can't afford it or because you don't have the time. Well, a lot of this great resignation is creating the time for people to pursue this. And now are there the tools to allow them to afford it? And we think this zero cost up front, paying only on performance, paying on outcomes, provides a great tool for people. You know, not every individual and not every situation is appropriate for investment tools. And this is very much an investment tool. Some people, it makes more sense to do grants. Some things it makes more sense to do grants. But we believe in this workforce development where there are identifiable career pathways, where there is measurable and identifiable income gains. We think this is really an appropriate tool that lowers the cost for people to change careers and pursue new opportunities.
Looking at the time, I think we have time for one or two more questions. Nancy, you're going to jump in, and then we'll wrap it up and turn it over to Jen. But Nancy, I saw you jumping in there.
Yeah, no, just very quickly, I'll take the question from a slightly different angle. The Infrastructure Act is actually the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the federal government is investing billions of dollars in job training. I'm sure it won't surprise anyone to hear that I think that the right path forward is intergovernmental collaboration, is to work together, the K-12 system, community colleges, universities, all kinds of training opportunities to get people together to find those people that need the jobs and give them the right training for those infrastructure jobs. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Augustine. Well, I think that's a good transition to one of the questions in the chat. Chris Doyle asks, and maybe this was probably came in the context of Mr. Glasgow's comments, but you mentioned deferred infrastructure needs and transparency in the area of deferred infrastructure in government budgets. Do you have a view on transparency around climate resilient investments that likely need to be made by communities, and how does that relate to our infrastructure needs?
First off, you have to sort of rank them, because this spans a lot of areas, including equity, fire, flood, drought, water and sewer, on coastal, on and on. There are some firms that have started to put climate scores on municipal bonds. That's a good start, because now you can maybe not perfect, but now you can actually see what bond issuers are doing. Green bonds are very faddish and ill-defined at this point, but I think that the financing markets are going to start to figure out how to put a price and priority on projects, because the capital will flow to the ones that are really needed, I hope.
Okay, well, I want to probably time for one more question. Before we go, I want to make a quick plug for a panel that's coming tomorrow. Milken said I could make this plug, but as we speak about budgeting and the needs for resources and budgeting, concerns about the cliff and really stabilizing our budgets, there's a panel tomorrow that I'm participating in called Creating Community Wealth and New Revenue. It's a public asset workshop. So this panel will focus on, cities around the country are allowing billions of dollars of assets. When we talk about the balance sheet of governments, billions of dollars of assets to sit idle without taking advantage of huge opportunities for revenue. So this session tomorrow will explore a way to tap into these opportunities by focusing on government assets, primarily real estate assets that have commercial value and can be managed to generate a community equity endowment or a new source of revenue from municipal budgets that can go for social impacts, that can go to address climate and other infrastructure needs, job training, but using these government-held real estate assets to create an endowment that can come back for a social impact. So please join this panel tomorrow, Friday, January 14th at 1 p.m. Eastern. It's listed in the program that you have for Milken. So I want to conclude by going to one last question in the chat, and this was for Jen. So Jen, I'd love to ask you this question and then hand it off to you, because then you can lead us through a deeper dive on many of these topics. But the question is, when you say data, what type of data are cities using? How are they analyzing this data? And what kinds of data might cities want to assess but have a hard time collecting or assessing it?
Thank you, Ben.
And let me maybe before I hand it off to you,
Yeah.
thank our other panelists, Dr. Nancy Augustine, William Glaskell, and Michael Grossman for insightful and thoughtful comments on really what's working well in government in the midst of this crisis, that we've seen some leaders step forward and some great practices that hopefully can lead to innovations in the future. So thank you to our panelists. And Jen, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Ben, for moderating such a great discussion. It is a great question. And when we talk about data at the municipal level, and also a great question to kick off this panel discussion, we believe that every interaction that government has with this community is an opportunity to collect data, but we're also not encouraging cities to just collect data for data's sake. We know that there's an immense amount of data that could be collected and analyzed, but when we think about how cities are leveraging data, they're doing it in certain buckets of work. One, it's to really understand the problem. Who are they serving? Who are they not serving? What are some of the challenges that cities and residents are facing? And data can be collected and analyzed to really deepen their understanding of what that problem is. The second is to start to develop solutions and really understand, how do we actually understand the data that we have or the data that we don't have to be able to develop, test, prototype solutions that can be applied through programs and pilots with our residents and our community partners. And the last is really to evaluate whether programs are working and whether they are actually effective and equitable. And so how you use performance data, or how you are able to collect evaluation data and results to understand where there are ways to actually improve the way that programs and services are being consumed by residents, and where there are opportunities to really scale solutions that are working. And for your second question, I may actually pause on that and ask our panelists to think about it as they talk about the programs that they oversee in their cities, especially as they've been building up some of these great initiatives and programs. What are some of the data that you wish you had, or that you wish you had more access to, that can help you as you think about centering data as a culture and also in decision-making along the way? And so I am so thrilled to be able to introduce our panelists. As Ben mentioned, we had an opportunity to learn and hear from experts around how state, federal, local government are working together and are building out new approaches to really center outcomes for residents. And now we have an opportunity to dive deep into this work and really hear from city leaders kind of examples of how this is playing out on the ground. And so joining me today are 4 incredible leaders, all either currently or formerly representing cities that have achieved What Works City certification. And I'm going to start by introducing all 4 of them, and then we'll jump in with specific questions for our city leaders to share kind of some of the innovations that they're seeing in their own cities. So first of all, we have Grace Simrall, who is the Chief of Civic Innovation and Technology at Louisville Metro. We're also joined by Michael Hammett, the newly appointed Chief Innovation Officer for the City of Phoenix. Ryan Smith, the Director of the Community Safety Department in the City of Durham, and my colleague Jen Tolentino, a Director at Results for America, who's leading our American Rescue Plan initiative and coordinating intergovernmental recovery response. She also just recently is joining us from the City of Los Angeles, where she was the Director of the Mayor's Innovation Team. Thank you all for joining me today for this conversation. Well, since Louisville is one of our 2 platinum certified cities in the country, Grace, I'm going to start with you. Grace, you have now led this Office of Civic Innovation and Technology, which has grown to be an 80+ person agency for the last 5 years. And in that time, you've engaged teams in so many services the city provides, different departments, from health and all the way to traffic. And I think an important program that you're leading is actually looking into creating a more equitable city, has been around providing access to Wi-Fi, including pre-qualifying families for low-cost internet plans. Can you tell us a little bit more about this work that you're doing around access to Wi-Fi in Louisville Metro?
Thank you so much, Jen, and I'm just thrilled to be here with my fellow panelists. It's so good to see you. So let me center the conversation by stating that this is our digital inclusion program. Like so many civic leaders, municipal leaders, we were asked to do more with less, meaning that these were new programs that were unfunded. And so often I'll hear from my fellow chief innovation officers who say, there is no money for this. How do we go about solving for some of the largest barriers that face our most vulnerable residents? And I think the first thing is that we ought to really leverage data to deeply understand the ground truth of what's causing the barriers or the challenges in our community. In the case of digital inclusion, the work is actually a 3-legged stool approach. We're interested in solving for connectivity, but also for hardware and for skills. It's really important that we solve for all 3, otherwise our residents really don't benefit. And so if we look at the connectivity problem, what becomes really clear, and I will say we had to collect new data. So the existing data was inadequate. The FCC has 477 data, which is self-reported by internet service providers. And there are lots of challenges around that. I won't go into details about that, but nonetheless, even if you map that data, it can reveal that there are significant gaps in your community. And so diving in deeper to understand those, the ground truth, we launched a program called Speed Up Louisville, which was a crowdsourced internet speed test website that allowed our residents to share that information with us. And again, it gave us really clear ground truth that the digital divide in our community mirrors the social divide. And with that information, and again, realizing that oftentimes the problem for our residents is a matter of affordability rather than pure connectivity or availability, we became really aggressive about finding out what opportunities existed provided by our incumbent internet service providers. And as it happens to be, we have 2 in our community, AT&T and Spectrum. They both offer low-cost internet plans, and it's for residents who either, at this point the rules have changed, but either are eligible for SNAP benefits or had a child who went to school that qualified for free or reduced school lunch. And so we went and used a lot of sweat equity to sign up families. By the time 2020 was about to begin, we had already pre-qualified over 1,000 families into these low-cost internet plans. And now I'll pause and say what's transformative as it relates to the silver linings aspect is that the Emergency Broadband Benefit Act allows families, in fact, to get the same benefit, but completely for free. And so at the end of November, we had already had 25,000 households enrolled in this program in our city. So you can see once you build the muscle of communication and engagement with your residents, so they're aware of these programs, when there's actually an opportunity to leverage something like unprecedented federal dollars, we're able to scale the work up by 25-fold.
Thank you, Grace. I think one thing we've learned a lot from, and cities across the country that have learned a lot from Louisville Metro, is your ability to think about philanthropy and private industry as partners. And in fact, you brought in over $5 billion in cash and in-kind grants from philanthropy and private industry. And so as you think about the partners that you brought on board, especially from the private sector, can you share a little bit more about how that's advanced some of your strategy and thinking around solving some of the most pressing challenges, especially as you think about reskilling and upskilling individuals in Louisville Metro through your Future of Work initiative?
Certainly. And so I really want to stress that innovation is not the purview of a single sector or organization. For us to really be successful as a community, we need to be broadly aligned with the school system, academia, our community nonprofits, philanthropy, both local and regional and national, to really push forward solving for these wicked problems that we all face. The particular one that you referenced, which is the Microsoft Future of Work initiative, is born out of, again, the mayor's strategic vision of really advancing family supporting wage jobs in our community, and very specifically by going after tech jobs. And so we have both a supply problem, we also have a demand problem. To solve for both, we had a incredibly unique opportunity to partner with Microsoft and form a digital alliance around establishing Louisville as a hub for AI, IoT, the Internet of Things, and data science. Again, transforming industry, especially our economic clusters around healthcare and manufacturing and logistics. So transforming those industries so that they're prepared for AI and automation, and they're thinking about not wholesale replacing jobs, but replacing tasks and what that new role will look like for their workforce. But at the same time, providing really meaningful workforce programs, including some very novel apprenticeship programs to remove those barriers that were mentioned in the previous panel that prevent people from being able to pursue reskilling opportunities. So just knowing that this is going to have to take the effort of all of us, linking our arms together, is just, I'm excited to share about it, and also looking forward for the new opportunities both ARPA and the bipartisan infrastructure law will afford us.
Thank you, Grace. It's exciting the way that you framed innovation as a way to engage all the stakeholders who need to be at the table and really think about the connection of what you all are doing to address certain challenges or future challenges that you can see by bringing in the private sector, school district, and other departments is really critical as we think about how cities should and continue to adopt data and innovation as they grow, not only their capacity to do it, but as they think about how they problem solve. I think we may have lost Michael, who I was going to go to next. So Ryan, I may go over to you next and learn a little bit more about what Durham is doing, especially as you're thinking about parking tickets. We know that it's amazing the impact something like a parking ticket can have on one person, especially families living in poverty. And so can you tell us first why parking tickets can be such a problem for people and what you and your team has done over the past few years to really help those that are impacted by the negative parts of parking tickets?
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Jen. Great to be here. Grace, great to hear about your work. It's always good to see you. So, and I'm going to be precise. I'm going to talk about traffic tickets. In 2017, we started focusing on really understanding the barriers to economic opportunity for residents who had previous interactions with the criminal justice system. And that started off with a lot of in-depth interviews with residents with that lived experience. And one of the things that emerged through those over 100+ interviews and conversations was the consistent theme of individuals having lost their driver's license years ago for unpaid traffic tickets or for failing to show up for a traffic court. And that stems from a North Carolina law, which North Carolina is not the only state to have this kind of law, that individuals' licenses can be indefinitely suspended for failing to pay a traffic ticket. And it doesn't matter the nature of the traffic ticket. And so we were hearing that. And then, I know we're talking a lot about data today. we wanted to understand the size of the problem. And when we did that and got data from the Department of Motor Vehicles and learned that over 40,000 residents in Durham had a revoked or suspended license, that over 80% of those residents were residents of color, Black or Latinx residents, that the average age of the suspension was 16.5 years, that the majority of these traffic tickets or charges were for minor moving violations, not serious offenses like DUIs or hit and runs. And all of those things to really understand the problem and to be able to pair that with what it meant in the lives of our residents. So residents who would talk about not only that it made it harder to get around in cities like Durham and many others that are still primarily built for cars, but that it's a real barrier to employment because many jobs have as a minimum requirement that you have a valid North Carolina driver's license. And so we recognize this both from the testimony, the lived experience of residents who talked about it, and then understanding the size of the problem as a real area that we needed to dig in on in Durham, and decided to build. We've also talked about collaboration today, and the city is only a small actor in this. We got together with our district attorney and our courts and others, our local law schools, to figure out how do we address a problem that is a really large problem when we recognize that our solutions historically have been built for a much smaller problem. We were doing things, we were having free legal clinics and things like that, but the size of the couple of hundred residents that we were helping a year to address legal matters when they couldn't afford private attorneys was never going to address the size of this problem, and we really had to rethink it. Let me pause there. I think you might have a follow-up question.
So many questions, Ryan. I think the work that you're doing is really incredible, and also so something that other cities across the country can actually learn from. And so from your perspective, as other cities think about parking tickets and the implications of parking tickets on individuals, what would you tell other cities on either collecting first or understanding as they start to implement or try to make these changes in their own government as well?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things we've learned is that this isn't just about traffic tickets or parking tickets. This stems from a lot of our kind of fines and fees and ways that we get revenue, and understanding the impact that has on residents' lives and how it oftentimes leads to inequitable outcomes. I do think it's important that the way that we went about this is the way that we've continued to go about some of this work, which is marrying understanding lived experience through qualitative research with really digging into all the data that we can get to understand the size of the problem and kind of key characteristics of it. So, in this case, understanding not only how many people had a revoked or suspended license, how long it was, which is just a staggering number, 16.5 years. We had 16,000 or 15,000 tickets, traffic tickets, that were all for minor moving charges, over $2.7 million of debt that we ended up waiving through this program that were 16.5 years old on average. And I just, that's a number I don't know that I'll ever forget that when we realize it from the data. But the other, another thing that we learned from the data, and this is why it's really important and helps build support for this, is that you can show the likelihood of repayment. And the reality is the likelihood of repayment after 2 years of an unpaid ticket drops, it isn't zero, but it drops to, it is a very low fraction of tickets that get repaid. So that largely becomes uncollectible debt that we're not going to get as a government, but that has significant long-term consequences for residents that we're paying for in other ways. Mm-hmm. And so, all this data, at least in Durham, built a very clear political will from all of our partners to do something about it. And then the doing something about it is a different story, and where data also comes in. And I don't want to preclude I guess I'll just say really quickly, one of the decisions we had to make is, do we build a program where people have to apply if they're eligible? We know that anytime we create an application process, no matter how good that process is, we're going to lose eligible people through it. And we ultimately made a decision for this problem that we weren't going to require people to apply for it. The law allowed it for traffic related matters. We were going to get all the individual level data, work with our district attorney that had and our judges, and just provide relief en masse as much as we could, where under a very strict eligibility criteria. But through that, we were able to dismiss over 50,000 charges for 35,000 residents and $2.7 million of debt that affected 11,000 residents, and do so in a manner where we created a new problem, which is then having to notify people after the fact. And that's still something that we are working on. It's a difficult problem, but you have to choose which difficult problem you're going to take on. And we decided we'd rather not lose. We'd rather not, if someone is eligible for relief, we might as well provide it and then figure out how to let them know about it, as opposed to making them apply for something and losing individuals through the process. That's my 2 cents, though.
Yeah, and Ryan, I think you spoke to kind of the equity implications of this type of program and the work that you're doing. And you also mentioned the need for collaboration to be able to execute something like this. And so some might say, and I think you spoke a little bit and would love for you to dive a little bit more into this and share with us how you were able to have these conversations with those that may say the city is giving up revenue, or we have a way to generate revenue that we need to then deploy into other programs to serve residents. How does the city start to talk about the trade-off between revenue and, at this point, something so critical to the city, which is ensuring that a certain target population is actually being served and have equitable outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think at a high level, the 2 things that were crucial in that are, one, showing the real harm that it has in individuals' lives, and showing how that harm is also disproportionately falling on residents of color, that there are inequities that we ought to and that we do care about. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is just showing the reality that our eligibility criteria was that a traffic ticket that was older than 2 years was eligible for this program, because it's not just about the revenue. One of the things that we had to address were concerns from some residents about accountability, about safety. Data helped in all of that. So on the safety front of people being concerned, to be able to look at the data and show that these are traffic tickets that were from minor moving violations. These are not, serious offenses were ineligible for this. We were able to use data to ensure that those types of charges weren't part of this. But also, I think people get that 16 and a half years of not driving for an unpaid ticket doesn't feel like justice, and having some time limit on those things. So in all of this work, as I know all of my colleagues know on this, you don't do these kind of things and expect everyone to come into agreement. But in Durham, I think using the data and also centering people's real experiences with this, and also how this type of program can be transformative, goes a long way.
Thank you. That's I want to also acknowledge that this is really difficult work. All of you are tackling a lot of work, and the way that you're approaching it, not only in a data-driven way, but also applying innovation and collaboration. And Ryan, to your point, centering it on the lived experience of your residents is the reason why we're able to actually highlight some of the successes that you're able to see in these programs. So congratulations, Ryan. Michael, we have you back, and we're excited to talk to you about what's happening in Phoenix. First of all, I want to congratulate you, as you're now the first ever Chief Innovation Officer that the city of Phoenix has had. And you're stepping into this role as the city faces a few inflection points. One, it is the fastest growing, I believe, city and region in the country, expected to double in size by 2040. And it's also the fastest warming city in the country, with an average daily temperature of around, I think, 86, maybe warmer. But as you think about your new role as the Chief Innovation Officer, and having now heard from Grace and Ryan about some of the innovations that they've been able to put in place in their cities, what are you excited about? How are you thinking about building that culture of innovation in Phoenix?
Well, thank you, Jen. It's great to be here with the group. And you and I go way back. We've worked on several projects over the years, I think starting in 2018. And so innovation has been part of the mission of the city of Phoenix for many years. But what we're doing now is, with this new office, we're coordinating all efforts across the city into the city manager's office, so that we make sure that the priorities of mayor, council, the community, the city manager are all addressed through this innovation effort, and people aren't doing this in silos. So the first thing I did was go and meet with the directors. I mean, I've worked at the city a long time, worked on innovation projects with them, but going into their departments and saying, what is your vision for innovation? Innovation can be everything, and Grace touched on it. It's no one person, it's everybody working together for this mission. And to me, I went in listening as much as I did talk, because, I didn't want them to think he's in this new role and he's coming in and we're already innovative. So I was listening, thinking, what are you doing and what do you want to do? What are some of your barriers? And we are the 5th largest city, the largest city manager council form of government, which means mayor and council set priorities, city manager follows through with everything. And so my office is in the city manager's office, and it's the size of our city is 550 plus square miles. Jen, you talked about the heat and the growth, the exacerbation of the heat island effect and climate change and what that means as far as our community. And we're growing. We're the fastest growing in the nation. And how do we keep pace with that? Well, it's data. It's the work we've been doing with What Works Cities. In the past session panel, Jen, you talked about the roadmap, and we've been following that roadmap. And it's a collaboration. It's looking and saying, how are we utilizing data? How are we sharing data? How are we empowering residents with data? And so this has been, I've jumped into this new role and really am connecting a lot of the work we've done over the years. Some things that have come up in meeting with the directors that are of interest. We own and operate one of the largest airports in the country, Phoenix Sky Harbor International. We're the housing authority for our city. We are a water utility. So we have all of these big picture departments that really run like their own, corporations, some of them. $1.6 billion in general fund budget, but then we have the enterprise funds like aviation and water that have fees and those sorts of things that they're operating off of. So it's a big challenge. The housing department, we have a Choice Neighborhoods HUD grant, and that grant was really about reimagining public housing, and that was starting with the residents. It wasn't us going in and doing this, partnering with Arizona State University heat researchers, partnering with Nature Conservancy, other community organizations, with the residents at the front of the table to say, here's what we want to do in our community. And so that's been really an interesting thing. And our housing director is really an innovative thinker. The one prior, Cindy Stotler as well, led a lot of change in the department. And so this has been happening over time. During the pandemic, we've all had to really, really pivot. And, innovation is happening across cities. It has to. So we did a lot of Wi-Fi expansion, and that was about equity in access to the internet. So we've free Wi-Fi across city facilities, but even beyond that, provided laptops and data plans to students in areas where the data showed us they were disconnected. They didn't have these, a laptop and a connection so that they could do their schoolwork and that they didn't fall behind. So, I'm really interested in what Grace has been doing as well. And again, we're all, becoming very nimble, we're pivoting, we're changing. And those are some of the things that we've really been working on. And our transit department with our public transit, we're the transit authority for the bus system within the city.
Oh, I think you might have some Wi-Fi challenges, Michael, from your end. And so
partner with Valley Metro. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. So yeah, we have on-site vehicle location now on our buses, which has allowed us to track routes and provide customer service information to our users. And that's connected to a new app through Valley Metro and the city of Phoenix, which really puts the transit, the routing system, the timeliness, all of that in the palm of the hands of the users. And we found 90% actually have smartphones, which is, that's the data we're looking at. Are we leaving anybody out with some of these innovations? And so we're looking at all of those as tools. And something very important, we're sharing that data with other software developers. This is about the residents, and there's no PII. It's providing it to Google and others, so that if the residents of their platform, they're able to navigate the system. And that is navigating the heat during the summer as well. So they can't be sitting at a bus stop for an hour. They need to track it so that they're safe.
Yeah, Michael, you bring up two really good points. One, you've previously, before this role, you served as the Chief Service Officer for the City of Phoenix. And in that role, you really prioritized how you're engaging residents and thinking about the voice of the residents to inform some of the challenges that you're having. And then, we can't not talk about climate change when it gets to Phoenix, Arizona. And as you and I partnered together on some of the really great initiatives coming out of Phoenix, one of them is now the heat ready work that you've done. And I think through your data, you were able to identify that some neighborhoods are actually 13 degrees hotter than other neighborhoods. And that data was really kind of spurring a conversation on what can the city do, who can the city partner with to actually ensure that the residents that live in those neighborhoods have access to cooling systems, have access to cooler weather. And so would you go a little bit into what Heat Ready is and how that program came together in the city of Phoenix?
Sure, Jen, and you and I go way back on this one as well, and we're really proud of it. It started with Bloomberg Philanthropies with an idea to come up with a pressing issue and a solution to that issue. So the City of Phoenix in 2018 came up with the idea of becoming the first heat-ready city and creating an actual roadmap that others could use. And I can tell you, even in 2018, we knew there were other cities that would be immediate in the need for this, some in the West, maybe some hotter cities in California. We never thought Seattle would be one and that Vancouver would be one this quickly. So that is something, Jen, you talked about the use of data. For the last probably 5 or 6 years, we've been working with heat researchers to place temperature sensors in some of these areas with underinvestment. And those are areas where you mentioned the disparity in the temperatures, and that can be related to the shade cover. The city has a goal of 25% shade cover across the city by 2030. There are parts of the city often tied to the income levels that have 1 to 2%. So we use that data, and also any projects that we were doing, like tree planting projects, placing the sensors to see changes to that. One thing we're really proud of is the Cool Pavement program. We're a leader in this. It's led by our streets department, and it's a year pilot program in 9 areas of the city where we're putting cool coatings on top of the asphalt. People drive around Phoenix and say it's 120 out and you've got black asphalt all over, which is really an issue with heat. It absorbs the heat and releases it at night, and that's part of the heat island effect. In 1 year, we've seen that this is working. The data from our researchers at Arizona State University is showing a 10 to 12 degree difference between the coatings and traditional asphalt. So this is in 8 areas. We're working with Mayor Kate Gallego and the council offices. They're each piloting an area, and they're using qualitative data from their residents. We're using quantitative data to show, yeah, this is an area where we have the lowest shade cover, we have the highest temperatures, maybe we have the most public transit dependent resident base. And then the council offices are hearing from their residents. So we're piloting these areas. We have about, I think, what is the amount? I don't have the amount of coverage at this point. Several hundred square miles have been covered so far with this coating. It is water-based, and it's important to us that it be recyclable so that when we do redo those areas of the roadway, we can recycle that, which is a best practice for the city. We've launched the first publicly funded Office of Heat Response and Mitigation. So it's both response and mitigation, led by Dr. David Handula, formerly of ASU. Jen, you know David, we worked together on the Heat Ready project in 2018. So at the same time they launched that office, the new innovation office, and we're launching an equity and inclusion office. So all of us will be peers working together really to ensure that we're covering all of these aspects. And you know, we've got climate change is impacting everyone now. And here in Phoenix, we've been, you know, ahead of the curve, and this is helping us continue to mitigate. And it's an exciting time.
Thank you, Michael, for sharing more about Heat Ready. You know, we've now talked about cities being at the forefront of global issues like climate change, economic development, fines and fees, and access to technology. And yet there's a new extra layer, which is the American Rescue Plan, $350 billion in state and local recovery funds. And so I want to turn it over to my colleague, Jen, who will share with us kind of how local governments are navigating this first ever influx, the largest ever influx of funding from the federal government. And then we'll come back as a group and ask a few more questions for the full panel. Jen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. And thank you to the folks that are helping me do the slides. I appreciate the opportunity to share some visualizations for what I'm going to walk you all through. So as Jen mentioned, I'm a director on the local practice with Results for America, and previously was in local government as the director of the Mayor's Innovation team. And so really excited to walk you through how we're thinking about this really transformative influx of federal funds to state and local governments. Next slide. So American Rescue Plan, as Jen mentioned, it is $1.9 trillion from the federal government. $350 billion of that are going directly to state, local, and tribal governments. This represents the largest ever investment of government in government. And we're really excited to see how states and localities are going to show up and use these funds to really transform how their residents experience government. One of the most interesting and really impactful ways that we think this is going to be happening is in how the U.S. Treasury has actually developed its guidance for how the funds are spent. We have pulled out 5 key provisions on how governments will be really focused on leveraging data, evidence-based provisions in order to further economic recovery, economic mobility, and racial equity. So not only is the federal government investing in a really transformative way in state and local government, but it is providing a roadmap for them to really build data and evidence capacity and use the funds in a way that will take beyond, like go beyond the actual very short timeline for when you can spend this money. So next slide. What Results for America did in order to sort of get a first cut and an understanding of how this money is initially being spent, because again, as I mentioned, we have a pretty tight timeline for how these dollars must be spent. We wanted to get an understanding by looking at 150 jurisdictions. Our first cut is looking at just cities and counties and one tribal nation. We assessed recovery plan performance reports, which were released publicly at the end of August and sent to the US Treasury. This gives us a first glimpse at how they are planning to spend their dollars. Back in August, that kind of gave us a sense of, you know, what are they going to be spending it on? Is it going to revenue replacement? Are they putting it toward new things? And what new things are they putting it toward? So this is going to be probably the first of its kind and most comprehensive cut looking at how people are starting to spend these dollars. Next slide. So before I get into the very top level of what we're seeing in these plans, I just wanted to level set that, again, these are from reports that were released at the end of August. Governments have continued to move at lightning speed to really move forward with investments. So this certainly represents an undercount in the breadth of government investment. So what I would say is when we're looking at this, we were doing the research and identified those who made clear investments as those who have actually gone through the budget process as of August 31st and allocated the funds. Promising are those who at least indicated that this was one of the places where they were planning to spend some of their monies, but had not fully gone through the process. And then we have some early plans, which is not quite the majority, but a good number, where they haven't quite decided or provided reports within what they published and sent to Treasury to tell us exactly how they're funding, what their funding priorities are going to be. Next slide. So I'm going to quickly go into the focus areas. This is just our quick and dirty breakdown of how we're seeing, based on those reports, what jurisdictions are spending on. So we have public health, which not surprisingly is the majority of jurisdictions are really focused on how are they going to be responding to the public health crisis. Infrastructure, which is going to include broadband, sewer, water. How are you just sort of able to make long-term investments? We have housing, workforce, crime and justice, and then education. So again, this is just an idea of looking at, where are jurisdictions really interested in spending these dollars. One thing I will say here too, surprisingly, and I know Bill on the other panel had mentioned, we are looking at counties and cities, and we haven't looked at states yet, and we will add states, but in this 150 jurisdiction cut, we didn't see as much revenue replacement as we had thought we would see. And we saw a lot of really exciting investment in like building long-term capacity. So next slide. So this is again, just kind of giving you a better understanding of what we mean when we're saying somebody is investing in housing. It is a behemoth of a category. It does include both ongoing stable housing. So the emergency rescue funds that were happening across the country. We're also seeing a lot of programs setting up supports for people that are experiencing homelessness. We're seeing plans to actually invest in the development of new housing, infrastructure, and this will also be, as we look at the bipartisan infrastructure bill that's coming down, how might jurisdictions parallel and use funds for different types of projects. But a lot of what we're seeing across the country is broadband infrastructure investments. And then workforce. This isn't just putting people back to work, but we're seeing that happening. It's also doing training and then looking at how do you make sure that employers are providing high quality jobs to their workforce. So not just focused on how are we making sure that employees are trained up, but how are we making sure that the jobs that they're going to are actually meaningful. And then finally, innovation and new programs. This is also a place where I would say we're seeing a pretty significant undercount, just based on how the reports were set up within Treasury. It's sometimes a little difficult to identify whether or not something's new or they're funding an ongoing program or scaling something. One of the things that we're tracking very closely at RFA as part of the 5 key provisions, a component of that is evaluation. So when we think about new programs that are being stood up, we are starting to pay very close attention to, if you're standing up a new program, is that also matched with evaluation components? So when you're pulling together your plan, what you're investing in should be an evidence-based approach, and the Treasury puts in place a number of options for you to identify what are evidence-based programs that if you stand it up, it will work. Or you can take a new idea and then you pair that with evaluation with a local partner and identify whether or not that works, so that in the future, if it's something that, we hit the fiscal cliff, you have the data to back up whether or not this is working. So this is, again, just a really quick cut at what we're seeing. And I'm excited to share more information. Next slide. So here, and I'll drop the link in a moment, this is where everybody can jump in and dig a lot more deeply into the data that I've very quickly walked you through. So it's a public dashboard that looks at the 150 jurisdictions. We look at the clusters that I walked you through that kind of tells you where people are investing. You can also look by the way that they're spending, you know, the money that's been allocated, how much is going to revenue replacement. We also dive a little bit more deeply into the evidence and outcomes component that is a really key part of the Treasury guidance. So we're looking to see, as these 150 plans are made public, how are they adhering to whether or not they're using data and evidence to drive decision making. So that includes bringing in community engagement, because we really have seen from the White House that they want to make sure that these funds are being allocated based on priorities that are coming directly from the community. So as we look at how jurisdictions are spending, we will be tracking that really closely, and look forward to hearing what people think. I will finally, before I close out, will just say, this is something that is going to be an ongoing basis. We are planning to add states to this evaluation within the coming weeks, which should give us a better cut and a deeper understanding of how within states and within jurisdictions everything is looking. And then we're also hoping to, within the next few months, do a dive that takes into consideration some of the decisions that have been made beyond just what happened in August. So we will stay in touch.
Thank you, Jen. What a great way to actually see how other cities, other counties are thinking about using and leveraging not only the existing funding, but additional funding that will come in. I want to bring all of our panelists back on and ask a few questions, and we'll encourage the audience to drop any questions that you might have in the chat. But to kick us off, Bill actually mentioned in the previous panel the importance of transparency, especially fiscal and budget transparency. And Michael, starting with you, I'd love to learn a little bit more about how cities are investing in building transparency and community engagement in their budget and financial decisions. So would you mind sharing a little bit more about the work that Phoenix has done to provide that kind of transparency?
Sure, and I want to go back to the cool pavement project that I mentioned. Is 38 square miles, so, and growing. So that's just to get that out there. We're excited about that. So Jen, we have a new tool called Fund Phoenix. It's actually, it did a soft launch right prior to the pandemic, and then we had it online last budget season, and now we've got it online again. And it's a really great tool that we're looking for innovative ways to engage our residents. We've had a participatory budget process going back 20 plus years, where we have the public hearings and the great dialogue and actually change the budget outcomes according to the feedback that we've received from residents. So this new tool is online. It's really actually fun to use. It's, you know, anyone who likes a computer game would love this. You can actually move around different amounts, budget amounts. So if you want to add to parks, you can increase the budget in parks, but you have to remove funding from someplace else. It must balance when you submit. So the great thing about this is it's a way for our budget and research director and our mayor and council and city manager to gather this information in spreadsheets. The data is all there. So when we do the hearings, it's great because people can speak and, you know, share what their concerns are, what they're focused on. When they use the Fund Phoenix tool, they go in and it's more comprehensive. It provides their comprehensive look at what, how they see our budget. And it doesn't mean that everything everybody puts in ends up in there, but we receive great data. And one example is the data we received on our alternative emergency response program. That came out of our last budget hearing process and through the Fund Phoenix tool. And we've pivoted our approach to this. In fact, Ryan and I are both part of a cohort that is moving in this direction. And so it's great to be able to, it's the data in the palm of our hands, and we can actually, you know, look according to different departments and different funding sources, So it's state shared revenue, it's general fund dollars, it's tax dollars, and all of that. And it's really, it's a great approach. And another thing that we are doing is with our ARPA dollars, we have an Arpa Dashboard, and that's providing a real easy to access look for our residents of where the money is going, and how it was decided, and what the impact is. So, and we're also looking at the one that Jen is working on through Results for America. It was great to see all the different cities and what they were doing in the way of ARPA.
Thank you, Michael. And Grace, I think when we talk about transparency, we have to touch upon what Louisville has been doing around their performance management for nearly a decade now. So could you share a little bit more about Louis-Stat and kind of the way that you're engaging residents and providing transparency through that program as well?
Yes, thank you, Jen. This is our enterprise performance management system. Every single agency, all 26, and I will say the city is a city-county merged government, participates in this program. It's our way of really living our values, meaning that we believe a high-performing organization, government included, ought to have employees who view their job in the same way. And when I say that, I mean, it's not just the active daily work where you come in and you're reacting to problems, oftentimes the same problems over and over again, but rather you have the bandwidth, the professional development investment, and you're empowered by your supervisors to do both continuous improvement work, so actually get down to the root cause of what's going on, and to do breakthrough innovation. It's everyone's job to do both of these things. Now, how do we live these values? We do it by measuring ourselves, and we measure ourselves very intentionally through what we call a weakness orientation. So we could measure ourselves and tell the public and our chief executives all the great work we're doing and how well we're doing. But instead, we intentionally force the departments to think about how to measure the gap, meaning how do we improve our service delivery? How are we weak so that we can actually solve for that? I'm really proud of that work. We force our directors and managers and supervisors to think deeply about, again, the role they play in service delivery, what we do for our residents, and set ambitious goals for the department to improve year over year. With the understanding that, in fact, if you're succeeding across all of your goals and your measurements, then you haven't set ambitious enough goals for yourself. So it's something we take very seriously. We, due to COVID, have had to switch to a virtual environment to have this regular report out to the mayor and senior staff. But I do believe that even in a virtual environment, the cadence and rigor that goes into evaluating your performance in this way ensures that we continue to deliver excellent city services.
And it's also a program that cities across the country has learned from and adopted as they think about holding themselves accountable and setting really ambitious strategic priorities for government as well. Ryan, I want to go to you and just hear from the city of Durham some of the work that you're doing around transparency, especially as you think about public safety data.
Sure, thanks, Jen. One, I think that we've probably been inspired by Louisville. We have a similar thing, we call it DSAP, but it's where we bring strategic initiatives forward on a regular basis to meet with city leadership and hold departments accountable with an expectation that we're not going to get it all right, and we need to be working together in this spirit of kind of continuous improvement. So thanks for that, Grace, and continuing to lead. On public safety data, Michael mentioned that we are one of a number of cities, and a growing number of cities, that are really interested in identifying additional opportunities to make sure that we're matching the needs of residents when they experience mental or behavioral health crises with the right type of responder and the right skill set. So that groundwork, like a lot of our work, has been laid first with data. So looking at, as I think, and this is not new, but doing an in-depth analysis of our calls for service data, looking at kind of 3 years of calls, making all of that data transparent and sharing it with the public, engaging residents in conversations. And this is kind of ongoing work of our department, and really understanding those situations and what types of response they want to see. One of the things that I'm excited about that we're going to be doing in the coming year, hopefully, is partnering with UNC's Center for Health Equity Research on a particular type of community participatory research that they call Stats in Action. But I would describe it as spending a lot of time in specific neighborhoods that may be concerned about over-policing or have specific public safety concerns, a lot of canvassing and in-depth interviews, but then taking that data and instead of bringing that data back to City Hall and just trying to make sense of it as city employees, collecting that data and then coming back to the community to share the data and invite community members into the making sense aspect of it and thinking through what are the next set of questions that we need to ask of this. I think that feels to me a really refreshing type of an appropriate way of trying to make sense of data. And I think that through that type of approach, we will likely glean insights that we would have missed otherwise if we had just tried to make sense of kind of qualitative survey data without that type of ongoing kind of feedback loop. So I'm excited about that as one way of continuing to understand how best to design crisis response services that send the right response based on the needs of residents.
Thank you, Ryan. We also have some really great questions in the chat. And Michael, I'm actually going to ask you one specifically around Heat Ready. There's a question around mitigating in your response, specifically whether or not Heat Ready is addressing built environment as well. So urban design and components that are tied to heat. It seems like there's some similar work that's happening in the city of Philadelphia around their Smart Cities and Innovation Department around collecting that urban design data. And so would love for you to share a little bit more on how the Heat Ready program is also thinking about addressing the built environment.
So that's a great question, and that is the part of the mitigation aspect of it. And so the built environment is critical, and some of that will involve. We've already started working with our planning and development department, some of the ordinances and codes related to orientations of buildings, related to what some of the coverings will be on the exterior, the shells of buildings, and some of that. And we're just looking, a lot of it will be, voluntary and education, looking out there and saying, here's some of the things that will mitigate it. And some could potentially be, fostered through city projects that we're working on. The example I gave of the HUD Choice Neighborhoods housing development, that absolutely takes into account orientation of buildings, materials used. A lot of that came from our residents who said, we can't walk around our neighborhood. There is no shade cover. The buildings don't cast shade. So we worked with heat researchers at ASU, Arizona State University, from many departments, not just the logical, heat researchers in sustainability, to look at all of those components. So yes, it will be a big focus of this department in terms, like I said, of education and also, just encouragement to the development community and maybe stepping forward from a city perspective.
Thank you, Michael. Jen, there's also a great question here from Bill as we're thinking about when you presented about revenue replacement, what are you seeing in the cities? Could it be that you're seeing less revenue replacement because revenue is coming from property taxes? And so would love your thoughts on overall kind of what you're seeing in the cities that are a part of this dashboard and also in this research around revenue.
Great. Yeah, it's a great question. And again, we haven't done the state comparison, and I know that's sort of where they've been focused. So when we get that data, we'll have a better sense of how it compares. But we had anticipated seeing, at least, more than the majority of jurisdictions of the 150 using the revenue replacement component of like how they can spend these dollars. In what we found, we only found that 63 of them did, which is 42%. So even taking into consideration that perhaps cities and counties are more stable and they have, other revenue coming in, having worked in local government during this time, your floor fell out everywhere. So we were surprised by this finding. I think once we have the state information, we'll be able to do a deeper comparison. I will say that our analysis only looks at, did you do revenue replacement with your funds, not what percentage did you use for your funds? So there might be some nuances where, like, of those 63, they use 90% of it toward revenue replacement. And so as we kind of think about, you know, other ways to look at this data beyond this first cut, I think that's a really good point to understand a little bit more what's behind, like, how they're spending and what percentage they're spending toward.
Thanks, Jen. And we have one last final question from the audience. As you think about capital investments, how are you thinking about green or ESG bond financing or other financial opportunities when you think about more long-term investments in capital projects? And this is open to any of our panelists who'd like to share some of the work that they're doing.
I mean, I can say from Phoenix, we're taking a comprehensive approach, and that's where we have the different offices, some of the new offices, existing offices, all working together with our director of finance as well. I mean, that's a key component to a lot of the work that we're doing, and also our budget and research department. I mean, those two really are critical. And again, it's that comprehensive approach, so you make sure there are no unintended consequences when you move forward with something.
Thank you, Michael. Grace, Ryan, anything you'd want to add?
I was going to say I'd have to defer to my colleagues in the Office of Management and Budget. However, I do think that there are some, again, unprecedented opportunities as it relates to the bipartisan infrastructure bill when it comes to climate and resilience. And so we're going to be looking into those in the coming months.
Thank you. So I have one last question, and I would love to have each of our panelists share their thoughts on this. We heard a lot over the last hour and a half, even in the first panel discussion, around data, innovation, and funding, so new dollars. So what do you want to see next in this work, and how are you using both data and the funding that's available to improve lives of your residents? And I will take a volunteer. If not, I will definitely pick someone to go first.
I'll go first. I think that what's so exciting about the opportunities before us is that we've actually put in a lot of work ahead of time, right? So we've, without access to this kind of funding, been able to drive so much creative, innovative solutions and learned a lot. I do think it would be remiss for me not to mention that when you innovate, you also are incurring risk. And so some things did not work out, and we will be stopping those types of initiatives or projects. But because we've learned so much, because we've been able to take the data, the community engagement and co-creation, and have shovel-ready nascent ideas that now can be activated through this type of historic funding, it's a really exciting time to be part of the innovation work. And if I know that you haven't asked this, Jen, but I'm going to offer my answer, which is, if I could have one wish, what would that be for the innovation work? And that is, I am always so impressed when I spend time with my colleagues and hear about all of the fantastic work they're doing in their communities. I wish that we could do a better job of learning what's going on and adapting and adopting their work, because so oftentimes we feel like we're just reinventing the wheel, and it's just not necessary. We might be running slightly different experiments, and I do applaud those efforts when that happens. But if someone has come up with an amazing solution, we are ready to adapt it to our city.
Thank you, Grace.
And I'll jump in and on what Grace just said. And, you know, one of the first things that I did when I was named to this role was to join a cohort, which Grace is a part of, and hearing about what others are doing, and so that we can support each other. Every city is unique, but we all have shared challenges. We all have shared opportunities. You know, for us here, I'm really excited about the equitable approach we're taking to a lot of what we're doing. And when I say that, that comes with a challenge. We have 163, I believe, languages that are spoken in Phoenix. I don't think that's unusual around the country. And so we've got barriers that we're trying to overcome. And 1.7 million people, how do you get everybody engaged, or at least in a way that they can engage, or that they're aware that they can engage. So, you know, I'm really excited about this opportunity as we move forward and, you know, and continue to innovate and innovate smart.
Thanks, Michael. Ryan? Oh, I think we may have lost Ryan. So Jen, I will go to you.
Okay. So I'm mostly excited, going back on brand about ARP, most excited about how it provides sort of training wheels for those cities who perhaps have not already participated in programs like What Works Cities in order to build those muscles around data and evidence. I think we did see all of those jurisdictions that already have those muscles and those teams in place were able to spend really effectively, really quickly, and get those dollars out to their residents in ways that made so much sense. I'm very excited that a lot of other jurisdictions now have that opportunity and a roadmap for them to do it. And how might they build capacity long-term so that this isn't just something that you get money for the next 4 years, but you are able to really change the dynamic for how government serves its residents and how it thinks about its engagement with them. So I think it's going to be a huge opportunity, and I hope we all take advantage of it.
Ryan, to close us out.
I'm the wrong one to close this out because all of my colleagues said all the great things. I will say, one, to Grace's point, we could have a whole panel about replication and both the opportunity and the challenges that are presented by that. I love that topic. You know, I think, and you know, in terms of ARP funds and data, one thing that I was encouraged by today, Jen, from your presentation is that it sounds like a lot of communities, and I know that this is true of Durham, are trying to take advantage of this as an opportunity to invest in potentially transformative ideas that are being generated by our community. And I think that work's really difficult. I think I'm glad that Durham has been over the last several years really investing more in community engagement and equitable community engagement strategies. And Michael, you mentioned participatory budgeting, and that's something that Durham's been doing more of, and being able to leverage those things in this moment, because we all talk about community engagement and we talk about it because it's important. It's also really difficult to do. And I think that this is yet another opportunity and motivation for government to find ways to engage community members in meaningful conversations that can identify truly promising ideas, but then also challenge us not just to stop there and to figure out which of these ideas does their promise actually pan out, and should we invest more in and identify opportunities to do so, and also how to have the conversations when they don't, and how to normalize that. I do think so much of it is beginning to normalize more that Grace talked about risk, and we have to develop the culture of being okay that some of our ideas aren't going to work, but also having that hard conversation and being able to be okay with that and move on, either work to refine something or move on to a different something else. So these are all great opportunities to continue to build those muscles, as others have said many times in this. So glad to be here today. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. I really want to say thank you to Ryan, Grace, Michael, and Jen for sharing not just new resources, but lessons learned and the incredible impact that you've been able to have in your study by investing in data and innovation. And I also want to thank Ben, Nancy, Bill, and Michael from our previous panel for sharing their insights and really setting the stage for this discussion. And then finally, of course, thank our Milken Institute team and all of you who stayed with us and participated in this session. Feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions or want to further connect about how we can continue to uplift and support local governments, or if there are any outstanding questions from this panel. And I really hope that you've been able to see the impact of a data-driven local government. And I will again say thank you again and pass it over to Matt to close us out.
Thanks, Jen. Excuse me. And thanks, Ben, earlier, and all of our panelists, and to all of you and attendees for attending today. Take a look in the chat before you leave, because that link will take you back to the closing plenary. But you know, a lot of things going around, and we just really appreciate you all taking the time and participating in this with us. So with that, we will see you later.